Morning Quad Cities, but first let's get a weekly stock market recap. The S&P 500 is up over 1.5%, the Nasdaq up 3%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average up nearly 0.5%. And last week, the S&P 500 closed at its highest level since August of 2022. The index also posted its best weekly performance in nearly 2 months. But the question that every investor is wondering this morning is, will this continue? And so that's why we have Mark Gravichevsky joining us this morning. So good morning, welcome back.
Morning, good to see you again. Very happy Monday.
Yes, happy Monday indeed. So what do you think is behind this rebound?
Well, last week's rebound, certainly welcome news, but, the ultimate goal for investors is, to return to and eventually exceed that all-time high that was set back in January of 2022. Now, in the entire 130-plus year history of the U.S. stock market, the market's always recovered. It's always rebounded, always went on to set those new all-time highs, David. We just don't know how many days, weeks, or months that will be, but in my opinion, I think it's going to take some time. It's going to require patience. From that all-time high we had back in January of 2022 to that low point in October, the S&P 500 stock index, as we can just see right here, all-time high January, low here. S&P 500 lost 25%, and the primary reason for this decline was, excessive, very, very high inflation. Now, since October, we have seen this, gradual yet choppy rise in the market on the hope and expectation that the worst of this inflation is likely behind us. But in my opinion, David, I think there's three main obstacles to returning to that all-time high we eventually want to get back to. First, I think inflation will remain historically high well into 2024. And that means, David, that the Federal Reserve will likely have to keep interest rates higher for longer. And finally, to what extent does the U.S. economy potentially dip back into a recession later this year? And until Wall Street gets some comfort on these three issues, I think any return trip to any all-time high will, one, likely be, very, very choppy, and two, it's going to take some time.
Yeah, and one of the things that you're mentioning is interest rates staying higher, and that impacts how much it's going to cost for us to borrow money. And the Fed just released its report on household debt. How are people looking right now?
Well, household budgets, have been under tremendous strain over the last few years. Just look at some of these numbers here, David. Total U.S. household debt in the United States, $17.05 trillion, wow, a record high. Since the end of 2019, right before the pandemic, household debt has increased a massive 20.5%. For 25 consecutive months, inflation has exceeded wage growth. Total credit card debt held by Americans in the country, $986 billion, another all-time record high. And look at this, the number of credit cards held by Americans in the United States, 572.9 million, also a record high.
Wow. Wow, that is, these are really big numbers. Yeah. What do you think is leading to all of us really increasing our debt?
Well, if you look at this and you look at this, it's in my opinion, this is the primary driver. For 25 consecutive months, David, inflation has exceeded annual wage growth. In other words, the rise in consumer prices has been greater than the rise in employee wages. And to bridge that gap, it's forced many Americans to take on a lot more debt. But also, look, I think it's unfair to say, look, if Americans simply, didn't spend as much money, didn't take on a mountain of debt, we wouldn't find ourselves in this position. But remember, the hallmark of this current inflationary cycle is that the goods and services being hit hardest by this inflation are those everyday basic necessities. Yeah. Think of food, think of clothing, of shelter, and energy. These aren't high-end goods and services.
They're non-negotiables.
Exactly. You need to buy these items to provide for you and your family. And to do that, unfortunately, it's forcing millions of Americans to take on a lot more debt.
Wow. Well, speaking of debt, the federal government, that debt ceiling.
That is a different conversation.
Yes, it is a different conversation, but next Thursday is really that deadline. How worried are you?
My indicators are the U.S. stock market and the U.S. bond market. Now, obviously, last week, as we just spoke about, we did have a very nice rally in the stock market. We're not seeing any negative impact in the bond market. So right now, Wall Street is expecting that, by June 1st, kind of that deadline, everything, President Biden, Congress will come to some negotiated settlement. Obviously, we need to keep a very close eye on the stock and bond market this week to see if any change in perception of this potential deal changes.
All right, Mark, thank you so much for joining us this week, and we'll see you again next Monday.
Enjoy your week.
You too. And here's a look at what's coming up on GMA.
In this morning's GMA First Look,